Okay, good. Right. Well, just for our viewers who will be watching this at a later point, hi, welcome. What you've got in store is, as we were just saying, just a kind of mini online version on online symposium of the kind of thing that we got up to in Paris back in April, which obviously due to various reasons, pandemic related and other, meant that not everyone could make it. So this is a little version of that. It's also hopefully a taster of things to come. We've got plans for events in the UK and also in New York next year in 2023, which hopefully will be another opportunity for us to get together with other people here, new faces that we're not even aware of just yet. And of course, we'll have online interviews and hopefully more poetry readings in the meantime as well. So we'll get started. We have 4 short talks, then we'll have a break, 5-10 minute break, and then 3 more short talks after that. Okay, good. Yasmin, let me hand over to you to do some introductions.
Sure. So first, we're going to have 4 short talks by Wojciech, Matt, Greg, and Jane. I'll introduce 3 of the 4 now. Wojciech Drag is an assistant professor at the Institute of English Studies, University of Warsaw in Poland. He's the author of Collage in 21st Century Literature in English, Art of Crisis, out in 2020. And Revisiting Loss, Memory, Trauma, and Nostalgia in the Novels of Kazuo Ishiguro, 2014. Wojciech has written several articles on Joe Brainard, most recently Embraceable Joe, Notes on Joe Brainard's Art, and Houses, Cats, Cars, Trees, Me, Outward and Inward Journeys in Joe Brainard's Collage Travelogues. We're excited to hear him talk today, likely, about Joe Brainard. Matt Proctor is the editor of Easy Paradise and a videographer at the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. His poetry reality show, Scenes from a Life, airs on Manhattan Public Access Monday nights at 11 p.m. And Greg Masters co-edited the literary magazine Mag City, edited the Poetry Project newsletter, was an art critic, and is the author of 10 books from his imprint Crony Books, including his latest collection of poems, The Complete Thoughts of Greg Masters. Rona, would you mind introducing Jane?
I will. Yes, sure. So Jane Hertenstein is the author of over 90 published stories, macro and micro fiction, creative non-fiction, and blurred genre. She's also published a young adult novel called Beyond Paradise, an MG novel, Cloud of Witnesses, and a non-fiction project called Orphan Girl, the memoir of a Chicago bag lady, which has garnered national reviews. She's also the recipient of a grant from the Illinois Arts Council. And recently a piece that she wrote was featured in a New York Times article, a really great article on women writing during the pandemic. She teaches a workshop on flash memoir and can be found blogging at memoriouswrite.blogspot.com. So we'll start with Wojciech, who's talking about Calais, Vermont, and Joe Brainard. If anyone has slides to share, you should be able to just click share screen at the bottom. But if that's not working for anyone, let's figure it out. That looks good. We can see that.
I'm just a second. I'm just trying to full screen it the way it usually works. It doesn't quite seem to work right now. Just a second.
No rush.
Okay, just a moment. Sorry, the usual shortcut doesn't seem to be curiously. Oh, can you see it full screen right now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you. And in terms of sound quality, is it okay?
Very good.
So?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Calais, Vermont, and its importance in Joe Brainard's life and work. It's a place where Joe Brainard used to spend almost all of his summers between 1965 and 1993. Most of the time for like the entire period from the beginning of June to the end of September. It's where the origin of it's where he got the idea for I Remember. It's the inspiration behind the Vermont Notebook, his collaborative work with John Ashbury. It's where most of his cutouts, his collages, his landscapes were created. And finally, it's also the place where his ashes have been interred. So just a word about the actual town. Calais, Vermont is situated in central Vermont. It's a town of 1,600 people. The house is situated in Elmsley Road, named after Kenwood Elmsley, Joe Brainerd's long-term partner. It's situated on a little hillock right by an artificial lake, which Anne Waldman christened Veronica Lake. The house was built in 1840, and in 1950, so just over 100 years later, the then famous, definitely, Broadway lyricist John Latouche bought the place as his country house. Latouche was the author of the lyrics for some, blockbuster Broadway musicals like The Golden Apple, Cabin in the Sky. He's also the author of the lyrics for the song Taking a Chance on Love, which has been covered by the likes of Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald. At the time, John Latouche was a lover of, or the lover of Kenwood Elmsley. 6 years after buying the house in 1956, he had a sudden heart attack at the age of just 41. He died in the master bedroom of the house, and the house was then inherited by Kenwood and John Latouche's mother. Kenwood bought her share of the house, and it became his. And 9 years later, 1965, Joe Brainerd, who was then Kenwood's boyfriend, came to the house for the very first time. And here we can see a photo from more or less the same period. And Brainerd's first impression of the house: suddenly we emerged into a clearing in the middle of nowhere, and there was Kenwood's place, a two-story farmhouse surrounded by the crisp, clean smell of pine. Initially, the place didn't have any amenities, but with the passage of time, it became more and more comfortable. In the late 1970s, Kenwood Elmsley sold a fraction of the estate to Ron and Pat Paget, who since then have been also spending part of their year over there. And last year, towards the end of August 2021, I was very fortunate to have Ron show me around the place. I was there as part of a fellowship. Anyway, so I'm extremely indebted to Ron and Pat for hosting me. And the idea behind this little talk is just to kind of express my gratitude to them. And so this is the cabin they built. They spend these days most of their year in Calais, Vermont. They also have a place in New York. And in the rest of my brief talk, I'm going to be pointing you to some passages in Joe Brainerd's writings, taken from the collected writings of Joe Brainerd, edited by Ron Paget, and from Ron's biography, Joe, a memoir of Joe Brainerd. And I'm going to, as I said, we'll focus on the importance that little place had for Brainerd. And I would like to show you a couple of quotations from Brainerd's writings, mostly his journals, about his anticipation of going to Vermont for this summer retreat. I'm not going to be reading out those, so if you can just take a quick look. All of those quotations come from the early 1970s. You can see he's referring to this beautiful country. He's talking about seeing Kenwood again. This was an opportunity to spend some more time with Kenwood. They never actually lived together in New York City, as far as I know, but it was during the summer that they had the opportunity to be kind of together more intimately. He talks about the needing a rest, and this place being this kind of respite, and he talks about everything else being etc. until he goes to Vermont. So this place seems to be like the real thing, and everything else is just waiting for the summer. So my impression is that, you know, by kind of examining the various references to the place throughout his work, we can say that this little country retreat functions as some kind of a haven, a refuge from city life, an opportunity to be with Kenwood and to be with some of his closest friends. And I'm going to say a little bit more about it in a moment. An opportunity to rest, but at the same time, an opportunity to work quite intensely without distraction of city life, and an opportunity to carry out some odd self-improvement projects. First of all, as Calais, Vermont as a haven, I would like to begin with a quotation from Kenwood Elmsley from an interview he gave in the late 1990s. He talks about the idea behind actually buying this place, and he says that John Latouche bought it in order to try and find a quiet place away from the city. And then a quote from Joe: "It's nice to be in the country in Vermont. There are fewer possibilities." So there is the sense that being there kind of liberates one from the temptations, distractions, dilemmas of New York City. And the image that you can see on the right is Joe's portrait of Kenwood Elmsley. I haven't seen it reproduced anywhere. I just took a photo of it in Calais, Vermont. It's displayed on one of the walls. It was also this great opportunity to spend some kind of intense time with his best friends. And here you can see Anne Waldman, Kenwood Elmsley. Among the notable illustrious friends that spent their summers with Joe and Kenwood were John Ashbury, James Schuyler, Anne Waldman, Michael Brownstein, Bill Berkson, etc. So the kind of routine that they followed was that in the morning, in the afternoon, most of them were occupied with their own work, and there was plenty of space for everybody to do their own thing. And then in the evening, they would commune and they would do various things together, smoke marijuana. There's a reference in Joe's journals to being stoned out of his mind on 3 John Ashbury brownies. There are references to them playing various games late into the night, chess, backgammon, charades. Reading out letters from women's magazines was also one of their pastimes. And in Rona's chapter in Yasmin's Joe Brainard's art, there is a beautiful article about John Ashbury's collages that date back to the early 70s, to the time when they all worked on collages together, and Rona suggests that we can, from looking at Ashbury's collages, we can get a sense of those late night conversations between friends. And in a different chapter, also in Yasmin's collection, there is a piece by Andrew Epstein and Andy Fitch who kind of talk about those evenings as a small-scale utopian negotiation of violence, still not long after Stonewall. The summers in Calais were also a time of intense rest. There are innumerable references to sunbathing in Brainard's journals. There is a lot of talk about this sense of leisure. And also Brainard talks about this, about trying to learn to be in the moment rather than to be always thinking about what he's going to do next, what project he's going to carry out next. But this was like an exercise in kind of meditation and just being, not doing anything. And it was also a time of reading for pleasure. Especially in the 1980s, when Joe didn't work as much over the summers, he would basically read from early morning to the evening. For instance, for many years, he would have this summer routine of rereading all of the novels of Barbara Pym every summer. he would read Victorian fiction, etc. At Dickens, Thackeray were among his favorite authors. And I know I have to. I'm almost finishing, so I'm aware of the passage of time. And paradoxically, despite it being this time of rest, it was also a time of work, especially when in those weeks when friends weren't around. Especially in the late 60s and early 70s, there are a lot of references in Brainerd's diaries to how many hours of painting he actually managed to squeeze in on a given day. 7 hours of solid painting in 1973. Boy, have I been working hard. 11 hours solid. And then in one of his letters to Fairfield Porter, Brainerd says, I set myself out to do 3 paintings, 9 inch by 12 inches in one day of the toothbrush rack in the bathroom. That's one of the 3 paintings that actually were created on that very day. Brainerd says with okay results, but I think most of us would probably agree that the results are more than just okay. Besides painting, it was also a time for Brainerd to work on cover designs, on collages, as well as on writing. And the earlier mentioned I Remember was largely created during the summers of the early 1970s. And the last kind of element of my kind of argument is that it was the time of carrying out some self-improvement projects. In 1972, for instance, Brainerd created this list of what he wanted to achieve that summer. Among the recurrent projects was getting a suntan and also managing to look good. As we can see in the photo on the right, he often succeeded in both. And this is okay. So this is the end of this little talk, and I would just like to finish with a couple of photos. This is Veronica Lake, as I got to see it last summer. I was able to see, for instance, the sofa where Whippoorwill lay sprawled in this fairly famous painting, which has ended up on Rizzoli's new edition. Some of you may be aware of this forthcoming volume of an album of devoted to Brainerd's paintings, and with this image on the cover. You can see in the house some juvenilia. For instance, this is a painting by Brainerd. I would never, at the age of 16 or 15, I would never have guessed. This is a drawing from 1987, and again, I didn't know that he continued to produce work late into the 1980s. This is the place where his ashes rest. And this is my final image. This is Pat I'm so sorry. This is Pat Paget and Ron Paget in the middle. And once again, I would like to express my great gratitude to them for allowing me to have this amazing experience of visiting the places that I could only dream of ever seeing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much. And I think we all probably want to look at those pictures as long as we can. Next up, we have Matt. I think he's going to change the narrative a little bit with some poetry. Is that right, Matt?
Yes. I thought I'd start out. I wanted to share this with everybody. I live in this apartment. I don't know if you can see this in Chelsea, Manhattan, but this building out the window, it might be overexposed. That is where John Ashbury lived. That's the London townhouse. I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of poets. Wallace Stevens lived down the street. The Chelsea Hotel is right around the corner. So John Ashbury's constantly overlooking. I'm going to read 4 short pieces. I consider myself a student of New York School, having lived in New York and just kind of read the work and working at Poetry Project and things. So I chose some pieces that kind of touch upon different aspects of New York school type things, I guess, aesthetic. I sleep in half. As day rises up my window, I'm a thin half and long with the sun, a carton of Neapolitan ice cream melting into morning, afternoon, night. A line break is almost melodic, like changing chords, then changing back. I listen to a lot of good advice, still don't know how to not lose everything. I like it when it's raining. Spent the last 2 years on drugs and wanted to go further into drugs. It's hard to change without wanting to get revenge. It's hard to change without changing. All these days hanging off me, I don't know what to do with them. 6:15 approaches gently. I take a cab there, rescheduling the unknown. I don't observe anything but the sound of sound. It's not meaning. I love it when the night opens its mouth to sing lightly its stars, a sequence of curves. Don't you think it's incredible when I hold the night, it's shaped like you? September 4th, Paris 2nd. The city emerged from summer with a new sense of purpose. I walk to pretend it's each other. We get away from this place, watching the city like it's TV. I've got TV in my cave. Oh yeah, this guy's painting McSorley's, $20 original. Outside, it's New York City and raining from an air conditioner. Walking up 8th Street, is that Willie and Phil? Jeanette in between? Frankly fabulous, the destroyer ruining people's lives in ways they secretly desire. Next stop, Greenwich Village. One person just gets in the way. The people beside you standing up cheering. Is Biden in the Minetta Tavern? Live above Pasta Sateria Rocco. Gonna cost me my fellowship. Met him down the village at the Cafe Bazaar. Chelsea girls. Redacted, I'm yours. Park Slope was a sleepy port on the canal, emptied and intelligent, suburban, not very fun after dark. Chelsea rattles with the mass of still clattering mercantile clipper ship empires. Take me to a Yankee game if you can. Jeter, A-Rod, Mariano Rivera and the Judge. Upcycled Metropole. Greenwich Ave is the fastest way home. Union Square is the waist. 14th Street a belt. Downtown is Manhattan's legs. Upper torso the grid plan. Its arms are bridges, its ankles tunnels, a body seeing an eyesight of sideways prisms, horizontal skyscrapers which are streets, vertical roads which are buildings, femur, tibia, Rockefeller, Seagrams. The bones we live in are homes, businesses, and offices. Its chest is Central Park, its abdomen Midtown, shoulders the Upper West and East Sides. Morningside in Harlem is lobes of a brain. Washington Heights forests, the beard, mustache, and sideburns. The village's genitals, west may be vaginal, east phallic and perpendicular rigidities. Christopher Street, one station, Sheridan Square, a G-spot. Is Tribeca and anus where we poop cars and trash out the Lincoln Tunnel, which is our colon? Brooklyn is a woman. It sleeps next to us in separate beds tonight. Brooklyn is a queen-size mattress. Manhattan is like sleeping in your car. I love my body, my big, juicy New York City, as Dr. Eziaba Arobi used to say. Let's walk it like I talk it. Tony Manero Strut, from Sheepshead Bay to Corlear's Hook. And this will be my last piece, April 19th, Cafe Life. My calendar came unplugged. My calendar's disconnected. See them run now. Here they come now. I see them running. They're jogging. Cellos, strings of guitars, guitars of strings. Seminary near Beachline. This coast really opens up. Barracuda was a gift. Why did I skip it? Now it's 2 blocks away and opportunities of futures lost. 6-room apartment over kettle of fish, which used to be the Lion's Head. Centered Nexus, 7th Avenue South and Christopher, Village Cigar, Fat Cat, now Cellar Dog, where my brother had his bachelor party, Duplex upstairs, Cabaret. I went after wrapping a cooking show. I was camera B on. Sheridan Square, Cafe Society. Stonewall is a constant party. The roots of integration can be traced to this neighborhood and these blocks in this country. Christopher Street gaping open wide to the broadside Silver River. There is a war being fought between the past and the future. New York City thinks it has to be brand new. It is learning to be an influencer city like LA or Dubai. What's good about New York is the depth of age, the junk rag shop on Houston and Bowery, or in Chelsea, the stuff that outlasted, that nobody threw away, sunk in the landfill metropolis, in delinquent, stabilized units, protected by low rent. They stay old, they yellow, while the new blocks gleam and erupt in destruction like hive combs of energy harvested drone flesh. The smelly, incoherent, angry bum in front of the liquor store on Avenue A is holding it down, is the only accurate thing in the neighborhood. It's boring to harp on, and there is a network of long-term residents who held on to their somewhat still affordable apartments, who were there before, who remember what it was like when cab drivers drove 70 miles per hour down 10th Street in snowball December, cool dip through the pines, another mile an hour by the Rhine, Hoagie Carmichael ghost tourist attractions and gentrifying adversaries. Beware cynicism, or it's already too late. Creative means you know the Adobe suite, that star cluster of intersections. The Indian wants the Bronx. They're reintroducing the Village Voice print edition. Maybe I'll get an office next door, step in where the elders left off, reading my diary in its entirety to strangers, amplified with portable, rechargeable public announce system of wireless mics across the grass. James Baldwin, Harold Norris, Tennessee Williams, Gene Shepard, Marlon Brando, E.E. Cummings, Anatole Broyard, Jack Michelin, Bob Kaufman, Howard Hart, Taylor Mead, John Brent, Hugh Romney, Maxwell Bodenheim, Kenneth Patchen, Harry Kemp, Eugene O'Neill, The Iceman Cometh. These are the poets whose steps I fall into nightly in the canyons of endued Washington Square grass and wandering footpaths and trout streams of Fourth, Waverly, Charles, Bleecker, Perry, Grove, Bank, Jane, Carmine, Barrow, Bedford, Downing, Minetta, a woods to get lost in, my Minotaur's residential labyrinth, one as fun to wander as to solve, to hope to live and never to leave. Souvenir corn maze I take made out of buildings for brunches of ease, skylights, garrets, doors, and rooms to stars where they sleep in half. Charlie Parker under the stage sleeping through the gig, while I hear gulls sculpting the horn, using the cut of the alley to find their way to Highway River. Laurie Anderson, Yoko Ono, Karen Finley, Carolee Schneeman, Hannah Weiner, Elaine May, Juana Barnes, Hetty Jones, Diane DePrima, Mary Baraka, Frank O'Hara, Emma Goldman, Maya Duran, Aeneas Nin, 10 Days That Shook the World. Now a communist could only afford this neighborhood in undergrad. Clay Woman, Amy Sedaris, Amy Poehler, Ayelet Paths, Ramble Down Gay, Ferry to Governor's Island, White Horse Tavern, even the road pave looks North Face Golfy and Financial. Get out of my city, suburban Chevy Tahoe, human ATM balance. I missed the ground floor of Dogecoin. I missed the second, third, and fourth floors as well. I just trust crypto, 65 viewers to my story. Saw Jerry Saltz on Hudson the other day. I thought he looked more commanding in person. It may have been someone else outside of La Bonbonniere. It's 1:02 a.m. I wake up at 7, enjoying the late nights. The side effects were about what was to be expected, a pretty routine and normalizing path and reaction to things, which maybe we need out or release thrown in multivalent directions. I hear my computer thinking in the other room. It sounds like a click and grind. Yard in Bushwick, house upstate. I like my friends and being pressed up against the wall by an over-reconstructed isthmus. Port of call, North River Bay. We only have the present tense, which keeps resetting its inception in blinding flashes. More fragmentary debris flurry, pieces less sledding hill, up with people, jolt calm, inner tubes slid us down ice, happiest days of my life, but never like in the park from a Tompkins Square clothes rack, which she was selling, microbiotic Spice Cove turning Szechuan. My seat is an emergency kitchen, $4 an hour to wash dishes 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, no daylight, just dishwater. But the street belongs to everyone after you get off work. six amigos drinking tall boys, sitting on crates in the bodega near the hot food. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you very much. I think Rona really wants to see the cover.
Yeah. That's gorgeous.
This is from my chapbook,
Yeah.
City Life. So that's
Wow.
that's on Bleecker Street, I think
Uh-huh.
in Charles. That's like a storefront. I took my notebook around. So this was all last April and May. This is all poems about New York, sort of right after the pandemic.
A really nice thing
Wonderful.
about that was just that it, for us, those of us, and there are lots of us, I think, who aren't in New York, it really did feel like we just had a little trip to New York.
Awesome.
Thanks, good job.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have Jane speaking about intersections.
What we talk about when we talk about the New York School and its place in memoir, I think about Bernadette Mayer and her poetry photo project, where she recorded the day in, day out, sunrise, sunset, cloud contrails. She spent 1 month in 1971 photographing both intimate and mundane moments and delving into the slippery nature of memory. She shot a roll of film every day and kept an accompanying journal, resulting in more than 1,000 photographs, 200 pages of text, and 6 hours of audio recording. In 1978, she chronicled One Midwinter Day. Essentially, this is just the life of an ordinary housewife. I think about the cost. She was married to Louis Warsh, also a poet, was raising 3 children, thus living hand to mouth. The money to develop all that film. The cost of time. She has remarked that the load of mothering and domestic duties fell primarily to her. Her memory experiment was an enormous risk. Sadly, much of Mayer's work did not see the light of day. Small private showings, abbreviated, slides lost. One is left wondering why. Why all the effort? When I think about Bernadette Mayer, I fall in love with how cool she looked, the writer, a young poet. And again, wonder, she was on the verge. What drew her into the sacrifices she made for motherhood, marriage? Was it a sense of belonging, a need for family? Memory, her memoir project, has been called boldly experimental, a record of a poet as she traverses early morning into night, where quotidian minutia morphs into the lyrical, where stream of consciousness becomes incantory. When I talk about the New York School, I think of James Schuyler, the morning of the poem. Now, did he write this in the morning or in one sitting? I don't know the answer to that, except he did like to get up in the morning to write. For example, his lovely poem, June 30th, 1974. It is a meditation, simply sitting at a breakfast table with a cup of coffee and looking out the window. The poem references friends, past conversations, passing thoughts, the sea. It situates us. The morning of the poem is much of the same. A middle-aged man with health problems, mental illness, at the home of his mother in Western New York State, having an internal monologue, riffing on paper, reliving old memories. For example, his eyes alight upon a postcard from Barbara Guest, architectural perspective, Italian, late 19th century. And here I quote him, "That gave me a pang. That makes me long to take you to that loveliest land. And we could visit Vincenza, walk up the drive to the villa." This long poem is in its simplest form, a memoir, a moment, a souvenir. The noun souvenir stems from the French, meaning to remember, come to mind. Beginning with Hymn to Life, actually beginning with his earliest poems and toddling to the morning of the poem, Schuyler records life in all its smokestacks, dirty windows, slack sunshine, people and places. When I talk about the New York School, I think about Franco Harris and his lunch hour poems. I do this, I do that. Recently, Franco Harris' lunch poems have been having a moment in popular culture. The book made an appearance in Jim Jarmusch's film, Patterson, while Jennifer Lawrence was caught on page 6, carrying a clutch purse resembling a paperback copy of lunch poems. These are poems that capture the everyday ramblings of a young poet, taking a break from his job at the Museum of Modern Art, where he sat at a desk selling postcards. His lunch poems, again, were these composed only at lunch, inspired by lunch? I don't know. Have a dizzy, dancing feel, alive with street energy. From someone alive to themselves, in touch, sensitive to their surroundings. In an excerpt from Getting Up Ahead of Someone, I am for once truly awake, letting it all start slowly as I watch instead of grabbing on late as usual. Where did it go? It's not really awake yet. I will wait, and the house wakes up and goes to get the dog in Sag Harbor. I make myself a bourbon and commence to write one of my I do this, I do that poems in a sketchbook, or this one. The eager note on my door said, call me when you get in. So I quickly threw a few tangerines into my overnight bag, straightened my eyelids and shoulders, and headed straight for the door. It was autumn by the time I got around the corner. Oh, all unwilling to be either pertinent or bemused, but the leaves were brighter than grass on the sidewalk. All this to say, unremarkable moments to everyone every day are what makes up the majority of the New York School poems. And when we talk about these poems and poets, we are revisiting our own mundane memories, the stuff of life, the essence of living. Today, I've heard the editors, when it comes to fiction, do not want to buy in anything to do with the pandemic. They are looking for nicer stories, nothing that reminds us of what we are living through. But let me say this about the pandemic. One of the things people admitted to when lockdowns hit, what they missed most was the routines, now disrupted or completely gone, unrecognizable. We have all suffered loss. We long for a moment, a poem, or our own words to transport us back to a time when we were free to stroll through an art gallery, jump on a plane to visit an old friend, or in some way carry on as we once did. What we talk about when we talk about the New York School is how do we get back to who we once were? Groggy over a cup of coffee, sitting with a sketch pad and pencil, talking about our boring life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And our last act of the first half is Greg, who I think will also be sharing some poems.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Yasmin and Rona. It's great to be here. I'm reading a title poem from this book. Wasn't supposed to be like this. This is dedicated to Leon, Odetta, and Camelia Hartman, who are the now adult children of my friend Phil. They're all my friends. From my couch of significance, I jettison all amusements and distractions, abandon art. Its manipulation, a risk not appropriate for my task, a confession for the hour. We baby boomers born in the middle of the last century lost the reins of our momentum. Some of us had sense enough to question the paths plotted out for us, but our capabilities measured dim in cacophony. There's so much we didn't do and so much we didn't accomplish. We fade, leaving you youngins with an ailing planet fuming with detritus from bad decisions. Armed with transistor radios and crappy phonograph players, bounded by the Korean War and undeclared Vietnam War, we flourished, a consequence of the nation's pause and commotion. Our proclivities were drawn to the rebels struggling to evade confinement in the village square. Conformity made James Dean cry. Our collective voice was forged from the howls coming through the airwaves, Black voices questioning the man. Why is everybody always picking on me? Or white versions like Elvis and Eddie Cochran, Bill Haley and Buddy Holly, dispensing to the populace an alternative to crew cut mandatory compliance with the engines of corporate grind, jolting our souls in the same way lightning bolts restored existence to Dr. Frankenstein's creature. Children, let me say, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones provided an antidote to all that was errant, most especially the brutal subjugation of our fundamental inclinations. Us young suburban teenagers who, blessed with privilege and comfort, could propel past definitions and explore possibilities, evolved into creatures past state and even parental control. And there was plenty deserving of ire, doubt, and resistance. The Warren Commission report failed to assuage lingering doubts of many in the multitude, sowing mistrust of officials. As the invigorating beats and Dionysian appeal of rock and roll gained momentum, so too did war in Vietnam. Stark casualty reports each day on the evening news like box scores. The government's explanation, verily it was needed to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, talking point, the domino effect, failed to convince those capable of thought. In August 1964, reports of enemy fire on US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin prompted the entry of US troops to foreign soil. But testimony from Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense at the time of the provocation, would years later expose to the flustered that the report had been a blatant lie, further eroding confidence in our elected officials for their duplicitous methods and disappointing betrayal of the rule of law. We raised our voices once again, determined to combat the policy sleaze. Spit on, denounced, dismissed, told to leave the country, we carried on, as when poet, Fug, Ed Sanders, attempted an exorcism of the Pentagon to expel demons from the source of power. Sick of a sick authority, long hairs and grandmas joined en masse, intent on influencing the arc of the moral universe. We'd had enough of clandestine CIA-led operations in the Congo and Bay of Pigs, assassinations and coups all over the planet to ensure American interests if you were one profiting from these indecorous activities. Directed to read such texts as the dialogues of Socrates, written by Plato, Xenophon, and other Greeks 4 centuries before the arrival of Christ, many of us seekers of truth pursuing investigation were trained in critical thinking, chiefly a series of questions for a small group asked to argue and elucidate responses underlying hypotheses. Our leanings verged from what our folks had intended. Maynard G. Krebs, Kooky Barnes, and Marlon Brando were more appealing role models for their wayward rejection of conventional adherences. Ginsberg's Howl and Kerouac's On the Road presented new vistas, an escape from the trap of straight, acceptable, prescribed values, a particular shot at grace and view askew from what we knew. Toward the end of the decade, we smarty pants of peaceful mind departed from our disparate communities, and as if streams converging into a river, gathered on a farm at Woodstock to hear the new rock geniuses celebrating fervent impulse and ordinary desire. And though the logistics were out of hand, the message carried far beyond our throb perimeter. Our illicit devotion to these men and women, as well our isolated disagreement with affairs of state, united, innocent of an agenda, young when sensations matter most. It was to be a final joy as the killings of the decade usurped our sweet velocity. The Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Black Panthers, Hampton and Clark, Kent State, Altamont, and Manson all but extinguished the ideals coalesced as flower power, challenging the validity of peace and love and rock and roll. But though our mass had been thwarted, the clean spirit breathed underground. Lo, the hippie diaspora shrank public visibility. As time moved on, swagger refined, couples hooked up, joined the ranks of the employed, and started serving the demands of the marketplace. Many of us lost some mojo from Nixon's escalation of carnage overseas, followed by the Watergate scandal, encored by a reign of Republicans impervious to people's pleas. Reagan's firing of 11,000 air traffic controllers, striking for safer conditions, better benefits, and more pay, decimating membership in unions from then until today. The brothers and sisters nurtured in the age of Aquarius, assimilated into the realm of family normalcy, or sedated their weary selves with drugs, work fetish, or sitcoms. I stayed high through the 80s to retreat from the state's abject cruelty, its refusal to accept a health emergency that seemed just to be affecting homosexuals and Haitians. Its devious shenanigans poured like immoral molasses, selling arms to Iran, subject to an arms embargo, to fund uprising in Nicaragua, prohibited by the Congress. 14 admin officials were indicted, though all convictions were vacated on appeal or pardoned by the departing Prez, George H.W. Bush, Vice Prez, when the spurious deal went down. In the new century, errant reports of WMD stockpiled in Iraq cited as need to invade the cradle of civilization. But this was a deceit perpetrated onto a gullible Congress engorged with a battle boner. Revenge, its only response to the attacks of 9/11, even though Iraq had nothing to do with the terrorist strike. Making the shaky case to the UN Security Council, Secretary of State Colin Powell offered tainted evidence, which when discredited, would end the Fall Guys' grand aspirations. So those of us eager for peace took to the streets again, as we had so often in the 60s, to emphasize our support of civil rights and opposition to the bloodshed in Vietnam. So we marched for peace, for justice, for protection of the planet, asserting as we could, for the good of all, our conviction that despite the oppressive fists, it wasn't supposed to be like this. In November 2008, when Barack Obama's win was announced at 11 p.m., your dad and I poured out onto Avenue A to share in the jubilation with the neighbors, assembling to commemorate the achievement and what hope it portended after what seemed like decades of values contrary to those we cherished at Woodstock and still held dear, if unpronounced. Through the decades, whatever the circumstance, no matter the crime, sharing with you has eased my mind. At times when ruled by fools and worse, we circumnavigate to build what's needed to savor delight and all that's right, embedded in the codes to which we ascribe on our journey through the mise-en-scène. Here it be without fireworks. These words, my effort duly wrought to validate your every thought. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Nothing I say will be interesting after that. So I'm going to not say anything instead and let us have a little pause for our break in between halves. Rona, should we say let's come back in 5, 10?
Yeah, how about 7? If we come back
7
at
is
8,
good.
It's 53, whatever hour it is, wherever everyone is. If we come back at the hour, and then perhaps hear some more talks, and then have a chat about some of the questions and ideas that have come up, and will continue to come up. Okay.
Great. So what do we do?
How are you, Greg? There you go.
I've been listening to John Coltrane all day.
Oh, nice.
Let me turn it off. Wait. Yeah.
It was really great hearing you read, and I was able to
how
read
nice,
along
yeah.
because I have my copy.
I cut
So,
out
yeah.
a few verses so I could hit my time limit. I hope that was okay.
Yeah, it was perfect. It was
Oh,
actually,
good.
yeah, perfect, I think. And such an interesting piece.
Thanks.
Yeah, really, really great. And I was I've been thinking about like poetry and resistance and kind of everyday rebellion, and how poetry kind of has a lot to do and say. And so it's really interesting to hear that and see it all listed, and kind of I've been writing about the AIDS crisis and poetry, and John Ashbury's poetry as well. So that's the stanza where you're kind of referencing that crisis really jumped out at me.
Does John Ashbury talk about it in some? I can't recall.
In so in April Galleons.
Oh, you know what? I never looked at that one. Okay.
Yeah, it's really worth reading for that. It's an odd collection because it's kind of overlooked.
Right.
Because I think it's got a wave on one side and something else really great on the other. But that to me seems to be, it's published 1987 and seems to be really, really thinking about that
Sure.
pandemic.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
This is good. This is good. So this broadcast will be a part of your seminar? How's that work?
Yeah, so it'll be something for people to watch and listen to. So what I'll do is I'll let everyone know on our network mailing list, we've got about, I think there's about 200 people now all around the world. And and so the idea is just that I'll share the program of talks. And so, anyone with a passing interest or a more particular interest in any of the titles or topics or people can just watch and listen and kind of have it there in the vein of some of our online interviews, but it was also just to give us a chance to meet and chat in the way that we managed to in Paris.
Are the events from the Paris event available online?
They are coming, so some of them are available.
Great.
So and they're great. Olivier did a really good job filming those, but he's been trying to publish or finish 2 books, I think, over the summer. So he's been prioritizing that. So once he's got that done, he's going to get back to editing the videos. So some of them are up on our YouTube channel, but the rest are to follow. And there's some like a great reading by Leanne Brown, for example, and just some really interesting talks about architecture and Franco Harris and watercolor and D.H. Lawrence and all kinds of stuff. Good. Okay, so I think we'll get started with our final 3 talks. So Yasmin's had to slip away for the baby, and Libby, who was due to be joining us, she emailed all of us, I think, earlier and isn't able to be here tonight. So we're without Libby. Libby was going to be talking about Eileen Miles inside of institutions. So hopefully we'll get to hear that talk from her at some point, maybe at one of the events that we're organizing next year. But I think for now we'll hand straight over to Susannah and Emily. Do you have slides or anything that you want to share? Is one of you happy to try and get that set up?
I will do the share screen now.
Great. So what I'll do, I'll introduce our 4 speakers, 3 talks, and then, as we did before, just hear from everyone, and then we'll have a conversation at the end. So we are hearing now from Emily, Setina, and Susannah. Emily's an associate professor of English at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Emily, is that where you are at the moment?
Not at the moment, no, but
okay.
yes. Yeah.
and the author of the forthcoming The Writer in the Dark Room, photography and biography in Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, and Marianne Moore, which sounds amazing. And Susannah Hollister is a writer based in central New Jersey, currently an NEH fellow at the New York Public Library. Together they co-edited Stein's Stanzas and Meditations, and really excitingly for lots of us, they're at work on a co-authored biography of Kenneth Koch, which we hope to hear a bit more about at some point. But for now, they're going to be talking about universal significance combined with almost universal unacceptability, New York School ambitions in the making of Locus Solus, 1961 to 62. Thanks.
I hope we are.
Yeah.
I am also seeing different options than I'm used to.
Can you see share screen?
Yeah, I get to that, and then I'm getting a whole set of icons. Oh, sorry.
Hopefully one of the icons that you could see is the presentation. Sometimes if you've got lots of tabs open, it shows you all of them.
Do you want me to do it, Susannah? I think I can get it on mine.
Security and privacy. Maybe so. I seem not to have the right permission. If you could do it, Emily, that would be great. Sure. Apologies for the extra.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see if this works. Did that go?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Okay. All right. It's not, has it come up for all of you? It's not come up for me yet. Okay, now it's come up. Good. It may have cut off some. Okay, well, we'll go with what we've got here. As Rona said, we are Emily Setina and Susannah Hollister, and we're at work on a co-authored biography of Kenneth Koch. Our project is a whole life study of Koch, who has remained under-examined and is due for new attention for his role as an animating force of New York school activity, and more broadly for his influence on how poetry is taught, written, and defined. We come to the questions that Rona and Yasmin posed for the network's meeting through our recent work in the archives, in the vast Koch papers at the New York Public Library, as well as the Ashbury papers at Harvard's Houghton Library.
Great, and Emily, thanks again for pulling up the presentation. Can you click the slideshow mode?
Oh, is it not?
At least what I'm seeing is not yet slideshow mode.
Oh, really? Let's see. Is it going now? Oop.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
So if you'd show the first letter.
There we go.
For today's presentation, we'll share two items that speak to the question of how the New York School defined itself in its moment. These are letters between Koch and Ashbury, dealing with the magazine Locus Solus, which was created, edited, and published by Koch, Ashbury, James Schuyler, and Harry Matthews, with 4 issues, 5, but 1 was a double, appearing in 1961 and 62. The letters we've chosen show the texture of Koch and Ashbury's intense friendship and their ambitions for the magazine, and a bit about how that friendship and that ambition interacted. We're coming to this material for what it reveals about Koch, but it also reveals a shared impulse among New York School writers at that time to present themselves as a movement, in spite of their reluctance to being grouped under the New York School label. So here is Ashbury writing to Koch, addressed as Space Monkey, in June 1959, pitching the idea of doing a magazine. Ashbury writes, Harry Matthews, egged on by me, wants to start a literary magazine, which I gathered would be paid for by him. I thought you could be editor-in-chief, since you have the most get up and go. We would, of course, print mainly ourselves and our friends' work, and anybody else we may discover who's like us, and give the Beat generation insufficient coverage. There is only one catch. We would have to print the work of Harry Matthews, which, nice as he is, And ungrateful as I am going to seem when this letter is included in a volume of our correspondence published in 2037 to mark the 90th anniversary of our meeting at Harvard, is awful. We'll focus on the joking aside. Ungrateful as I'm going to seem when this letter is included in a volume of our correspondence. This is a striking remark to find in the archives, a moment of a subject anticipating a researcher. And it's also a telling one. The joking tone, exaggerated by the unlikely choice of a 90th anniversary, doesn't mask the seriousness of Ashbury's ambition. He was writing to his friend, but imagining a greatly expanding audience, reaching presumably beyond their deaths. The magazine, by publishing these writers together, could be a step in building the kind of literary careers future readers would appreciate and want to study, as here we are now doing. Notable is how he casts that ambition, not in terms of the group he's just described, ourselves and our friends, and anybody else we may discover who's like us, but in terms of one friendship between Ashbury and Koch, pointing out that it predated the group and locating it outside of New York City at Harvard. This is a pitch, and singling Koch out, as he does with the earlier praise for Koch's Get Up and Go, was a way to sell him on doing the magazine. It's a frequent move in Ashbury and Koch's letters. Readers of the 2037 volume can look forward to other digs at friends that confirm, by contrast, Ashbury and Koch's own friendship and mutual admiration. Here, the move to the individual studied the project that would strengthen the group, and studied it through the very act of denigrating its underwriter, Harry Matthews. As the letter makes clear, tensions existed from the start, even in the core group the magazine served to promote, and more tensions would follow in its 4 cycles of editing and printing, with debates about whose work to include and how to manage rejections, concerns about quality, and the risk of tacit monotony, to use Ashbury's phrase from a later letter. What let these editors move forward in the project, defining their movement, was situating it within other overlapping circles, narrower and broader relationships, past and future time.
The second letter we'll show is from Koch to Ashbury, early in 1961. When Koch was at work editing the second issue of Locus Solis, the magazine didn't end up having one editor-in-chief, but rotating editors. Koch writes, "Dear Jellybean Sunglasses, for issue number 2 of Locus Solis, I must have a nest of ninnies, as the whole issue is to be devoted to works written in collaboration, and that is one of the world's greatest ones." He goes on to list various collaborative works of the past and other jointly written works by friends as candidates for inclusion in the issue. Here on page 2, he asks, "What other past poets have written together? Please tell me all you know. I am meaning for this issue to have universal significance combined with almost universal unacceptability, like thoughts of death." Zing. As in Ashbury's letter, individual pairings served as the basis for defining the New York School as a movement and for Koch's own ambitions. Koch's contribution in an issue that proved influential was to feature writers in his circle working in pairs, and also to place them in a distinguished and international lineage, a canon of collaborations. Koch outdid Ashbury's exaggerations, casting his ambition for the magazine in the very broadest and boldest of terms, universal significance, but also almost universal unacceptability, like thoughts of death. The sardonic note fits into Koch and Ashbury's play of extremes, the repartee of overstatement in their correspondence. But it also picks up an element fundamental to Koch's writing and sense of vocation. Actual thoughts of death pervade his early poems, starting in high school, when the knowledge that he'd be drafted into World War II propelled him to write more, and even more immediate thoughts of death enter his writing through and after his horrific combat deployment to the Pacific as part of an infantry unit. A revelation reading Koch in his archive is the recurring preoccupation with war and mortality in drafts from adolescence on. Here, shifted into a simile, Thoughts of Death gives Koch another way of claiming universal significance for the work of the group, casting it as essential and certain, something people will resist but won't be able to avoid. The remark points to a characteristic of Coke and his circle, seeking while also disdaining wider audiences and greater recognition. With his hyperbolic humor, Coke reworks the stance, making significance and unacceptability not a contrast, but companion features of a shared New York School aesthetic.
As a coda to this pair of letters, we'll end with another item from the archive that seems to speak directly to the reader, here the biographer. This is a poem Coke drafted in 1993, in what would be the last decade of his life, well after the era of early New York School self-definition. Coke, after an inconclusive attempt to transcribe a bird call, writes, "To interpret someone by what he says and by what others say about him is entirely to miss the point," then softens entirely to partly. He ends the poem with the lines, "We live in order to see, not be seen." The note in the corner, phone Paul Violi, points to the ongoing network of poetry friendships that the New York School label partly, if not entirely, describes. The we in the closing line suggests a plural of poets. But now their ambition has shifted. The Locus Solus letters show Coke and Ashbury in their 30s, very much wanting to be seen by everyone for decades to come. The older Coke checks that impulse, directing the poet's interest outward, yes, but to his subject, the bird, rather than to his audience. In cautioning biographers, though, the poem does show Coke thinking about his future readers. And it's no surprise that we, would be on his mind as he worked in the 90s to assemble his papers for sale to the New York Public Library. And as the first biography of the New York School poet appeared, city poet Brad Gooch's biography of Franco Harris was released the same month Coke wrote this poem.
Reception and reputation may not reveal the power of bird or of poet, but a poet's concern for these things exerts pressures with real and significant effects. Among the things we see, going back to these primary materials, are enlivened friendships, deliberate exclusions, a public claim for expanded definitions of poetry and poet, an approach to poetic language that seeks only partial understanding, the varied effects of an ambition to be at once universally significant and almost unacceptable, to be like thoughts of death. Zing. That's it. Let's see.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Much to think about there. Thank you so much. Yeah, lots to think about, and really looking forward to hearing more about Coke when your book comes out in due course. So let me hand over to Marcella next. Marcella is going to be talking about poets and artists still hanging out. Marcella is the 2021 recipient of the C.D. Wright Award in Poetry from the Foundation of Contemporary Art. And recent books include To Husband is to Tender from Black Square Editions in 2021, The Prospect, Delete Press in 2020, and a translation of Michel Metai's book-length poem, Earth's Horizons, Les Horizons du Sol, from Black Square Editions in 2020. Marcella, thanks so much for joining us. Do you have any slides you want to share, or are you just talking?
No, I don't. I should,
that's
but
okay.
I don't.
No,
Sorry.
that's okay. No.
Since it's on art, I should have a whole
The mix
slideshow.
is good.
But thank you for having this. I really appreciate it. I was very sorry to miss the in-person event. This is all great. I can't wait to talk about it, everyone's contributions. So one aspect of the New York School I've always been fascinated with is the depth of relation between the artists and the poets. And this is something I feel is still very much vibrant and proceeding and growing and changing. It's much more inclusive, many more artists of color, poets of color, women in that now. And I just want to kind of give a picture of a little bit where it's been with John Ashbury and James Schuyler and so many of those relations, and what it is today, what I see is today, which has not, I think, been codified at all, this relationship. So it's a little bit of a snapshot of what I feel is a very exciting thing going on. So I'll start a little bit with like my own inspirations and just go from there. And some artists that I often write to and from and around, holding their work in mind, include Via Selmans, Agnes Martin, Ad Reinhardt, Alma Thomas, Glenn Ligon, William T. Williams, Hilma Clint, Katie Pratt, and then my family members who are also all artists, my mother, my father, and my husband, Richard O'Russa, with whom I discuss art every single morning over that cup of coffee that was mentioned earlier. I talk art with poet friends, with poets who are not my friends. Art is a regular ongoing conversation in my life, perhaps like sports to other people. The normies, as my son, with whom we talk art too, would call them. There's an overlap with some of the artists we talk about with the artists who collaborated and were comrades with the original generation of New York School poets, such as Jane Freilicher, Joan Mitchell, Willem de Kooning, Philip Guston, Franz Klein. And then there are second and third generations, Joe Brainerd, George Schneeman, Donna Dennis. I think of Bernadette Mayer as someone who is artist and poet, especially with memory. Greg Masters certainly has had an ongoing intense relationship with art and poetry. And the generations overlap and blur and mix and transform. And that strong connection is continuing onwards and outwards. Artists and poets still hang out. So I'm thinking of a regular Friday evening ladies' tea that's hosted by Ann Tardos, who was herself a visual artist and still paints, that began before the pandemic and continued into Zoom. The tea includes poets and artists such as Simone Forti, Susan B., Julie Patton, and Tony Simon, who show their work online via share screen. And the poets, Jennifer Firestone, Tanya Foster, Evelyn Riley, who react to the art, and the poets and the artists react to each other through these shares. Tanya Foster hosts gatherings when she comes to New York that include artists and poets and food and laughter. The title of Foster's collection, A Swarm of Bees in High Court, relates to Max Ernst's painting, A Swarm of Bees in the Palais de Justice, and has a painting by Wengichi Mutu on its cover. This is her book. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from Tanya's explanation of how she wrote toward that painting, just to kind of give an idea of her compositional process and how that was inspired by Max Ernst. The vibrant chromatic chaos and the haunting title of Max Ernst's painting were two of the triggering tunes for this poetry. I first encountered the painting in the mid-1990s at the Menil Collection in Houston. For years, a small notebook carried the title and a small off-color reproduction of the work. I found myself turning over time to the question of how I might contend with Ernst's parsing of a visual field. Several unfinished pieces were written as riffs off of Ernst's provocation. Some lines and pieces focused on color, on relationships and hierarchies between and among hues. Other pieces focused on a sense of fragmentation evoked by the small two-dimensional areas allotted to each other on the broad field of Ernst's painting. And then she has a section called Swarms. And so this is one of the poems that relate to that kind of compositional visual process. We understand light within a form, the sand or water whipping it. We understand light, we say, because of what we say: flash, blaze, blind. So that's one kind of example of cross-fertilization. Thaddeus Mosley's sculptures at Karma Gallery in East Village were the first exhibition I saw several months into the pandemic, when it was almost safe to enter a gallery again. The scent of the space, the particular odor of white paint, undisturbed by furniture, mixed with the scent of wood through my mask, and made me feel at home again, in myself, in the world, as a poet, although with the awareness always that the white cube of the gallery is unwelcoming to many. It often guards its whiteness jealously. Poet Ed Roberson writes of Mosley in the exhibition catalog. that his curiosity and ability to sniff out ideas, to change direction, to solve problems such as weight and space have sculpted a mask of the art which his mind wears. I think of Roberson's writing on Mosley as this sort of writing only a poet writing toward an artist who is in a deep connection of friendship may write. John Yao, who was at first a student and then a dear friend of John Ashbury's, writes of and to art more than I think any other poet right now. His numerous reviews of young and established artists on hyperallergic are a spectrum of the unknown, the overlooked, and the well-known. A poet seen fresh and anew and constantly. Through his writings, I've discovered many artists and new ways to look at artists I already know. Frank Walter, Don Voisin, Nadia Haj Omar, Tammy Wynne, who herself collaborates with poets and writers to create intensely aesthetic book arts. Yao has interviewed artists such as my mother, Susan Fracon, as well as William Bailey, and has rewritten sentences from those interviews into pantoums into his new book, Genghis Khan on Drums. In one such pantoum, I heard how painter William Bailey scattered eggs on a table for his still life, incorporating randomness into figuration. I'm just going to read a few lines from the pantoum because I love it so. I paint things made of clay, just as the pigments I use come from the earth. I place the pale eggs on a dark, unadorned tabletop and let them roll into place. Brown and ochre stoneware bowls beside a white porcelain pitcher. The dusky red wall is not meant to symbolize anything but itself. I place the pale eggs on a dark, unadorned tabletop and let them roll into place. I want to paint in a way that the eye disappears into the sky and trees. The dusky red wall is not meant to symbolize anything but itself. Variations on a theme are of no interest. A bowl and cup are not ideas. Anselm Berrigan goes with John Yao to see art often. The cover of Anselm's book, Pregrets, has a piece by Jasper Johns on the cover, also titled Pregrets. I saw many familiar poetic titles at John's two-part show at the Whitney and Philadelphia Museum of Art, titles like Corpse and Mirror, which I thought original to one of John Yao's books, 0 to 9, a magazine edited by Bernadette Mayer, and his name escapes Vito Acconci. So I expect more titles drawn from Jasper John's show to surface on a new spectrum of poetry books soon, as it seems like every poet in New York saw that show. In another book, Come In Alone, Berrigan experiments with a new form of words arranged about the line of the page with a space in the middle, empty space, reminiscent of the space of a canvas, a gesture toward the visual possibilities of word on page and painting on plane. Figure and ground with word as frame, and space is filled with what the eye sees, grain of paper, emptiness, possibility, invisible words. Berrigan is also friends with painters Erica Speck and Zachary Wallard, and I am friends with painter Jimbo Blashley, who is friends with poet Lytle Shaw, who is married to painter Emily Clark, whose work has also been on Berrigan's covers. Poet Edwin Torres is married to artist Liz Castagna, whose dye painting hangs in our hallway and whose recent body drawing films led me to write this. Positioning upward and down, the spine is start and end. Between spiral of vertebrae and complicated cartilage, the line of body is simple until. Artist Portia Munson's work has been on Brenda Coulter's book covers, and Brenda took me to visit Munson's place upstate, which is a large sculpture-like home or conceptual piece. Julie Patton's home in Cleveland is also a conceptual piece, a sculpture-like home, also performance piece, an invitation to creative space that during Zooms she walks us around, showing us her mother's paintings while singing, her handwriting, people visiting, her Mertzbau, like Kurt Schwitter's Mertzbau, transforming space of bees and art and ecology and music. Will Alexander writes poetry, but is also an artist whose work appears on his own covers. The visual opens to the language within. Rachel Blau Duplessis has integrated the practice of visual making, arrangement, and collages deeply into the composition of her drafts. Artist and poet Atel Adnan is another person who embodies both practices at once. And Cecilia Vicuña, who just had a show at the Guggenheim, is someone else who straddles art and poetry. Meme Bersibrugge has collaborated with Kiki Smith in beautiful ways, shining light upon its organs, as she explained it. Renee Gladman's book, One Long Black Sentence, is amazing art juxtaposed with text, and the two interplay. Highly recommend that one. I haven't mentioned the word ekphrastic yet, because I feel like all of this is moving far beyond ekphrastic poetry, and another poet who's kind of attacking that word in a way is Jennifer Firestone, where she's writing poems that include the entire social experience of seeing art with friends, and how someone might connect to art at the moment in one's body with friends around one, which I think is an incredibly full voyage past ekphrastic. Here's a little excerpt from her poem. Art asks me to not go back home just yet. I have to do something with my art feelings. They are unwilling for me to move on, compose myself. They want me to revel so deeply. So these are some examples of what is going on right now between poet and artists that are just strong and essential, as they were in John Ashbury's day with his incredibly deep friendship with Jane Freilacher, as they were when Kurt Schwitters and Tristan Tzara went on vacation with Sophie Tauber-Arp and Jean Arp. I'm listing these connections and they're now in their history, but I have not talked about why they are so important. In place of that why, I recommend reading the poems written by these poets, and read a little bit of An Ut Pictura Poesis is her name by John Ashbury, just to finish. Something ought to be written about how this affects you when you write poetry. The extreme austerity of an almost empty mind colliding with the lush Rousseau-like foliage of its desire to communicate something between breaths, if only for the sake of others and their desire to understand you and desert you for other centers of communication, so that understanding may begin and in doing so be undone. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcella. That was wonderful, and really just I'm struck by how many names you mentioned there. I mean, it's just extraordinary, and that in itself is such a useful kind of map of who's talking to who, and that idea of writing towards, I think, is just gorgeous. So thanks so much. We're going to finish now with a talk from Molly Murray. Molly, hi, and thanks for joining us. Molly's an early career researcher, recently awarded a PhD from the School of English at the University of Sheffield, and her research is looking at the relationship and intersection between dance and poetry. So art and poetry, dance and poetry, and this is obviously in the kind of post-war American avant-garde, and Molly's talk today is called "So Much in This Ballet is Reciprocal: Embodied Intersubjectivity in Franco Harris' Poetics of Dance." Molly, did you have slides, or are you happy to?
I don't have slides, but I'm going to share the poem that I'm going to talk about.
Okay, great.
It makes a bit of sense. So this is kind of adapted from what will be the introduction to a much more extensive look at dance in Harris' poetry. Okay. Franco Harris frequented the city centre on West 55th Street, attending performances of George Balanchine's New York City Ballet. For O'Hara, the dancer served as an aspirational figure of poise and wisdom, an aesthetic body both graceful and charismatic, and offers a view into O'Hara's poetry in which he strikes a continual balance between self-reflective poise and energetic bounding. O'Hara's poetry appeals to dance through a sensory emulation and relies on kinesthetic empathy for the reader to experience similar sensations to that of viewing dance. In presenting his theory of kinesthetic empathy, Theodore Lips posits that when we literally feel what the acrobat suspended high in the air above us experiences, When we see someone sucking a lemon, it's as if we tasted the acid. When someone cries, we often feel a lump in our own throats. John Martin similarly argues that it's virtually impossible for us to resist translating what we see or hear into our own present and active experience. In his Poetics of Dance, O'Hara sought to find new ways of organizing language into verse to establish a poetics that provoked the same embodied sensory experiences in the reader as one experiences when watching dance. In an essay written in 1961 titled Notes from Row L, O'Hara writes that one of Balanchine's greatest achievements is in making the dancers be the dance, be human and yet have the theatrical grandeur of the specific occasion of the dance. In his 1955 review of Balanchine's Roma, he enthuses of the collaborative dynamics presented between dancers on stage. So much in his ballet is reciprocal. The review is not only a display of his love for the ballet and particularly Balanchine's productions, but also doubles as an insightful view into his own creative values and poetic practice. A poem written by the individual poet may also mimic this reciprocal dynamic. As O'Hara professes in his mock manifesto, one of personism's minimal aspects is to address itself to one person other than the poet himself, thus evoking overtones of love without destroying love's life-giving vulgarity. The poem is at last between two persons instead of two pages. Just as a performance is something that occurs between the dancers and the audience, in O'Hara's model of creation, a single author poem is not simply an art object, but occurs as an event, or as he writes of Roma, an exchange between two intimately connected persons. Ballet, O'Hara suggests in the review, is grounded in a series of collaborative relationships. He outlines the dynamic between the audience and the dancers, crossing the boundary of the stage into an exchange of dialogue, writing that Roma is more a matter of choice, something you may live with the dancers, a vital, social, exhausting, and vivacious exchange between you and them, like trying to keep up with an exciting conversation in a foreign language. Rather than mere spectators, the audience are consistently involved in the performance via translation, producing their own meanings and responses in real time, feeding energy back onto the stage. In writing the review through the lens of his position as spectator of the dance, O'Hara provides a commentary on his own project, in which his poetics function as a form of responsiveness, setting up a reciprocal relationship between poet and reader, as well as between the poetic speaker and the poem's dedicated addressee. For O'Hara, the discipline of dance in particular, through the relationship between the dancers and the movement they perform, offered an aspirational muse for his poetic mode, personal address. Whilst this doesn't always come in the form of a poem about dance, as a point of introduction, Ode to Tannakill Leclerc offers the most poignant example of O'Hara's use of the ballerina figure in shaping his verse. Written in address to the New York City Ballet principal ballerina following her retirement, one of the poem's primary thematic concerns is with the dancer's body, 2 knees, 2 wrists, 2 minds, and incredibly agile, but eventually becomes immortalized, stuck still in the metaphor, the extended philosophical columns. Most poignant, however, is O'Hara's dramatized portrayal of the viewer's place within the dance, in which the ribbons that had previously been imagined as encasing the clerk's heart shift to entrap the speaker himself, where in the innocence of my watching, had those ribbons become entangled, dragging me upward. Where O'Hara begins this line conscious of his place as simply a spectator of the events on stage, the magnetism of the clerk's performance lures him in, up, towards the stage, ending in a complete blurring of the distinction between performance and reality, as well as a breakdown of the formal divide between stage and audience. The ribbon acts as a metaphor for the unspeakable bond created between performer and audience, embodying the emotionally felt connection between them that forms over the course of a performance that O'Hara alludes to in his review. Expecting only to innocently watch the clerk dance, what instead occurs is an imagined intimate dialogue, as if in the ballerina's movement, she's addressing herself personally to the individual viewer. Consequently, the speaker of the poem feels himself in his spectatorship to be part of the performance. The meaning making of the dance is a collaborative exchange in which the audience doesn't just see, but engages actively in the emotion and narrative of the production, experiencing themselves moving with or even as the dancer. This momentary collapse of boundaries between stage and audience is interrupted by the speaker coming back into their body. From way up there, my neck hurts. Reinstates the physical setting of the poem speaker, viewing the movement of the ballerina positioned above him on stage, emphasizing his position as audience. Where O'Hara's poetry frequently makes attempts to grasp at the metamorphosis, he writes of the clerk's almost mystical potential on stage. You are always changing into something else, and you always will be. O'Hara doesn't depict Leclerc as devious in her disguise, however, but idealizes the dancer's capacity to slip between characters whilst remaining intrinsically herself. Everything you do repeats yourself simultaneously and simply as a window gives you something. Here, O'Hara reveals a recurring objective of his own poetics, always oscillating between revelation of self, the poem as window, and the self as inherently multiple and concealed. The apparent ease with which Leclerc moves across the stage, as if she were only breathing and everything happened around her. Oh God, I've lost her face. Is lamented upon her exit from the stage, because when you disappeared in the wings, nothing was there. What lingers in this empty space, however, is the kinesthetic memory of the action that had just taken place, the superb arc of the question, alluding to both the physical form of Leclerc's body positioned in balletic poses and to the speaker's professed unknowing of the dance's meaning. What overcomes this reflection on the memory of movement, however, is the sense of threat that comes from the stillness that's replaced it, of a decision about death. From this point, the tone of the poem shifts from idealized praise to anxious speculation. Now Leclerc refuses metamorphosis in evading being immortalized as that which others perceive her to be, but in her escape and in her stillness risks an end. By addressing the poem to the ballerina and positioning the speaker as the spectator of her performance, physically sat in front of her, Ode to Tannehill Leclerc occurs between two persons instead of two pages. The reciprocal exchange of performance and collaboration is carried through the poem as O'Hara writes, firstly in response to the arc of the question posed by Leclerc's dancing, and secondly, invites the dancer into a reciprocal dialogue, awaiting response through the final line's questioning, are you? The reciprocal dynamic that O'Hara identifies in his Roma Review and Personism essay is manifested in the poem's image of the encasing ribbons. Through the intersubjectivity of the speaking self and the subject of the poem's address, presented literally and figuratively as moving bodies interacting in the space of the poem, O'Hara's poetics of dance is integral to the intimacy and sociability that defines much of his poetic project elsewhere.
Thanks so much, Molly. That was really another, gorgeous talk. And I wondered if I might just finish by showing a picture of her, just because, can you see that there, just to finish. So yeah, and again, just really thought-provoking. It struck me, and perhaps my comment in the chat isn't super coherent, but just thinking about Matt's poem about New York as a kind of body or set of body parts, there seems to be something happening here that's really interesting in that sense. So thanks so much, everyone. We've got about 20 minutes if we want to just open up the conversation and kind of talk through some of the ideas. Yasmin and I've just been kind of keeping track / posting questions as placeholders in the chat, so we can certainly pick up some of those. But if people have got comments or questions that we might start with, that would be great. Does anyone have a question or a comment that they'd like to offer before we kind of turn to mine and Yasmin's? Greg.
I could say I enjoyed all the presentations, the talks, and the poetry. I've been out of academia for decades, so it's nice to get a foot in, and this one was such a nice blend of the art and the writing about art. So I'm glad to have participated. I appreciate all the investigation into New York School poetry.
Greg, for you as someone who is an ex, would you say an ex-academic or a?
Yeah, I got a master's degree.
Yeah, but as someone who's writing and continuing to write and kind of writing in and around this this kind of, as we know it to be, a kind of very loose tradition or set of influences, and this was a question that I had, I guess, for Matt and maybe also for Marcella, but just like, what's your sense of where or what the New York School is kind of right now? I don't know if if that's specific to the kind of post-pandemic era, but like Wojciech's talk was making me think Joe Brainard's not really doing all that much work in New York at all. Matt, you've got John Ashbury kind of looking down on you as you are writing and thinking and walking around, and I wondered what are people's views or ideas about where or what New York School is in 2022.
Well, I think Marcella's talk was actually kind of a great answer to that in a way. Just all the relationships and all of the people, the painters, the poets. I mean, to me, that is kind of the lineage in a way. I mean, I was sorry to miss the conference in spring. I was scheduled to do a talk. I had to be at Poetry Project to film some stuff, but the subject of my talk was kind of about how the Poetry Project is sort of a New York school in a way. The Academy of the Future is opening its doors, and that lineage, I feel like, coming from the original people, John Ashbury, Franco Harris, Barbara Guest, James Schuyler, Kenneth Koch. When you're here, you really see that it has kind of lived down through the years, through the Poetry Project, through all the kind of interdisciplinary stuff. I mean, Greg knew Ted Berrigan. He published him in the Poetry Project newsletter. And I think with the New York School, a lot of the second, third, fourth generation, that kind of work hasn't exactly been discovered in the same way that maybe the original stuff has. But to me, people like Edwin Torres, Anselm, and Edmund, they're very much here and they're still doing it. That being said, living in New York is a completely different situation now, and the material circumstances, I think, that allowed for that lineage to sort of thrive at the Poetry Project with Mimeo and things. There were rent-controlled apartments. It was cheaper to live. So definitely the circumstance I'm in is totally a freak thing because of the pandemic. Everybody lives in Brooklyn. So in that sense, I do think living in New York does kind of like affect your consciousness, that causes you to write in a certain way because there's just so much stimulation and so much action. So in the sense that there's not people actually living in Manhattan, but at the same time, I think things like Franco Harris have almost been assimilated into the poetry world at large at this point. Like everybody kind of writes a little like Franco Harris at this point. So it's an interesting question. I know there's kind of this disavowal that the New York School is even a thing, but I do think that the poetics and the aesthetic are definitely worth studying, and they're something that I think can be applied everywhere. Even if you're not in New York, you can sort of write about where you are, location and time, and the presence of that, I think, can go everywhere. But I would definitely be interested to know what Marcella Durand and Greg think as well, and whoever.
I mean, I think I agree with much of what you said. Is that we have Anselm and Edmund Berrigan, absolutely, and for me, art just really is an ongoing. There's a great show up right now in Off Paradise Gallery where there was a poetry reading with Peter Gizzi and showing the collaboration between Clark Coolidge and Philip Guston. So something kind of from the past, but then more contemporary work as well by younger artists and poets. And so that was like a really an example, this sort of ongoing overlap. And it was great to hear poetry in that art setting too. I do feel like poetry in New York, because of these material lives pressures that you're referring to, which are really intense in New York, I feel right now. I mean, I grew up in New York, and right now I'm just like this, like I always say the city is done, and now I really feel like it's just insanity here right now in terms of rents and disarray. But I do also feel that in a way poetry is finding interesting spaces always. So there's outdoor readings, there's readings in strange places, and the work is always kind of so inflected by this combination of like squalor and art, high art. I mean, to me, the high-low art is between like the squalor of the New York City street and the artwork. It's anyway. So I'm amazed that you're in Chelsea. I feel like Chelsea has managed to drive out every actual creative practitioner.
Jane, did you want to?
Well, it was just a thought. I just think if Franco Harris could have lived forever, social media would have been something, he would be all over that thing. You know, he would be composing on Twitter, Instagram, he would be writing, using these platforms.
Alice Notley does.
I totally agree.
And networking with all of his friends. It would have just been, it would have been really explosive.
The other thing about Franco Harris that was so interesting is he was one of the very rare people who loved the renewal of New York. Like he thought it was so exciting to see large swaths of tenement buildings torn down and new buildings put up. And I just marvel, neon and sunlight, you know, he just loved that process of New York. He embraced that, which is something I actually don't think so many poets who live in New York or take inspiration from the New York School agree with so much. So
it was fascinating that the UN building, they remark and comment about that building being built. And just in rereading Memory by Bernadette Mayer, it's so eerie. She comments about the World Trade Center being built and seeing the steel girders just sort of, in a way, in their infancy, looking like what they looked like when they were, you know, destroyed. It's just these architectural things that they've included in their poetry are, you know, they're just like timepieces just stuck in there.
Bernadette actually recently said something about how memory, that probably even the light of the photos is no longer because of climate change and pollution. And I was like, wow, that is amazing to think that even the light in these photos is not the same now.
Is Molly still here?
Oh, she's
I don't
dropped.
see her on my screen.
No, I don't see her either. I'll keep an eye in case she's just lost signal.
Her talk made me think of Edwin Denby's dance writing. I'm not sure he would be considered a New York poet. Maybe he's pre-New York School. He certainly affected all those people, but his dance writing was so great. And I didn't know Franco Harris wrote essays about the New York City Ballet. Where are those? Matt, do you know?
I think in that Standing Still and Walking in New York, maybe that book might have some of them.
And maybe at the back of the collected poems. I'm not sure if there's any dance ones in that, but Standing Still and Walking, for sure.
That poem. Yeah.
It's quite hard to get hold of, I think.
Right.
One thing that I think everyone has kind of done today is gesture to or put into practice some kind of like act of documenting. Just going off of what you were saying, Jane, you know, that idea of, yeah, looking at those photos in memory and reading about the World Trade Center. But, you know, Greg, your poem kind of, again, working through this kind of process of documentation. Matt, your work's doing a similar kind of thing. You know, Marcella, like I said, with the kind of mapping of names, Wojciech, your photos alongside the kind of Brainard works, and Emily and Susannah, again, we've got archival materials and things that we've just, you know, just not seen. And again, I wonder if something, you know, perhaps it's integral to most poetry and much kind of critical writing as well, but is something to do with preserving stories and kind of, you know, like thinking about the light of 1970s New York and what that might have looked like, and the ways in which those things are lost. I mean, Susannah and Emily had no idea about the nicknames, for example, among the many interesting things you said. But I just, yeah, that's just another kind of open question, is the kind of act of documenting or bearing witness or telling stories something that I guess maybe connects New York school writing beyond its...
Good point. Yeah, I'm thinking of it's claiming a place.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
one's own, away from the, you know, the American challenges of, you know, trying to fit in. You know, this is a way to just assert a different reality, or you know, fashion a reality that's more comfortable, validates, you know, the person for what they are, rather than trying to, you know, be a normal American.
That idea, just to quote your poem, the view askew from what we knew, which I love. But yeah, maybe there's something of that.
Yeah.
Susannah and I were thinking about the question that you asked, Rona, of Wojciech's work about the New York school outside of New York, that one of the reasons why we have so much Ashbury and Coke correspondence from this period is because they weren't in the same place. One of them was in Europe and the other was in New York. So I don't know, that's something that struck us just in thinking about this kind of intensive foundational period, is that even then they weren't in the same place. And thank goodness for us, because it means there are these incredible letters they were writing each other. And so much of it was this epistolary friendship too, that they're continuing to kind of bolster and compete with and outdo each other. And Susannah's just been at the New York Public Library these past weeks and keeps finding postcards from John Ashbury that are misfiled because he always signs with some other writer's name or just some crazy made up name. So all of those are really kind of interesting, fun things to keep discovering in the archive.
You can recognize the handwriting and identify it.
The style, yeah.
Oh, we can, yeah. Very attractive. But documenting for sure, but also in Coke in particular, maybe, there's so much nostalgia, you know, that I feel like a great deal of the writing we see him doing about New York City is later in his life, thinking back to the 50s and 60s and a New York that's not there anymore, but that was so formative and important in his life. But it's coming into the poetry again as a memory of something from an earlier time, you know, which is a really different impulse than that documenting of the present, right? That we saw other examples of.
So almost seeing New York as a like temporally removed kind of place rather than being physically, because he was still in New York, right? Yeah.
Right. I think he was the New York school, but it was most consistently in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, yeah, Wojciech, that was the question that I had for you as well. Like I was chatting to someone recently who'd been putting on an exhibition about Brainard in Boston, and not really about Brainard in Boston, but like taking Boston, the fact that he was in Boston as a point of departure. So you've got him there in Boston, and then I was recently in Tulsa as well. So I was like, okay, we've got him in Tulsa, and now he's like, your talk just really kind of highlighted how important Vermont was to him and how it seemed to be really productive by contrast perhaps with what he did in New York. And I wondered what your sense of that idea of New York school outside of New York is.
It seems to me that almost all the friends that came, especially in the 70s, to that place were people who lived in New York City on a regular basis, and so there's this odd kind of sense of having those two, of being kind of, and with Brainerd, I must say I don't actually know whether he ever stayed longer, whether he was ever tempted to just settle there. And I know that Kenwood Elmsley would spend more of his year there. And I came across this passage somewhere that he went back to, Kenwood Elmsley went back to New York City at this regular time when he normally did. And then he was so shocked or outraged by the city that he instantly came back, and it was an 11-hour journey at the time. And so I wonder, it's something that I need to research a little bit more, and I'm going to ask Ron about this, whether this was a genuine question that any of them actually considered, whether to just leave New York City behind for good. And in a way, Brainerd did, even though he continued to live in New York City for most of the year. He kind of backed out of the New York City art world in the mid-70s after his kind of Fishback Gallery show, which was very exhausting, a big success, but like he decided to basically quit the madness of the art world there. So in a way, he kind of chose to retreat, even though he would spend most of his months in New York City, but kind of living a more kind of relaxed, kind of Vermont-like life. Sorry, I haven't reached any conclusions about this, but thank you so much for making me think about this.
But just so you know, he stopped making art apparently, but he came to a lot of poetry readings. I would always see him at poetry readings with his shirt unbuttoned. It was kind of, so he was still, I guess, on a social level, still engaged with poets, and not just at the Poetry Project, at back room of bars readings and stuff.
Would he do readings? Was he still?
I never saw him read. I can't remember if he ever did.
Well, Ron and Kenwood Elmsley, I think they tried to kind of, they disagreed that he stopped. That apparently he continued to kind of work until like late in the 80s, but in terms of kind of, well, not as much as before, and that he wouldn't display, like he wouldn't have shows, and so people assumed that he didn't, but apparently he did. And but evidently, that there is this great kind of difference in terms of output beyond like
public showing. Gallery. The gallery scene then was just impossible if you weren't connected, and it's like now there's a lot more galleries.
Thank you.
Bernadette Mayer too. I mean, Midwinter Day was not written in New York City, so I find her output interesting, and how some of it's very definitively placed outside of New York. So she challenges, I think, what the definitions too.
But it's like, sorry, Greg, after you.
No, I was just saying, A Train Ride, Ted Berrigan's book, which is his voyage out of New York, just for a couple days, but it's still a New York poem because it's it's crafted by New York school sensibility. His knowing who his audience is, or who he imagines his audience might be.
Yeah, that sense of a New York sensibility. I was struck by something Jane said about kind of finding those spots of quiet or ordinariness or boringness in the context of something quite quite chaotic. I find that really interesting in Maya's work. There's kind of, it feels like such a lot, but there are these really interesting kind of little moments where you can almost pause and dwell, even though in a text like Memory, it's kind of asking you not to do that. And that reminds me of Franco Harris, even though Maya's writing is obviously really quite different, but that idea of kind of finding spots of time to dwell in. And just thinking about train ride as well, that again makes me think of correspondence and kind of moving between places, and Brainerd, Daniel Kane's putting together a book of Brainerd's letters, which is super exciting. But he too was someone who used Vermont to kind of correspond madly with tons of people. And like Emily and Susannah, I think that sense of him being outside of New York is a real gift to readers of his work today.
We can't get the telephone calls, but we can read the letters.
Oh, imagine.
Email messages just don't have the same impact.
No.
Typing letters and
The selected emails.
The selected emails.
Yeah.
And the postcards as well. I mean, there's such a huge number of those out there, like some in archives, but God knows how many are just somewhere. Yeah, any other, did anyone else want to ask anything or comment on anything just before we finish?
I enjoyed all the presentations. Everybody was great. Nice to meet everybody.
Yeah, thank you all. It's great.
Yeah, it was really a privilege to hear you all. I've just been really lucky because I got to sit and listen. So thanks so much to all of you for giving up your time today, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are. It's been really nice to just have a conversation about these things and to bring together folks from across the miles. So hopefully we will see each other either through a screen or in the flesh at some point, doing similar things in the future. Like I said, we've got plans for a couple of events next year, one in probably the spring in somewhere in the UK, and then one in New York, likely in October, and hopefully something up in Hudson as well. The Flowchart Foundation and Jeffrey Leppendorf are really keen to put something on with us there. If anyone's around on Sunday at 5 p.m. UK time, the Bergens and Alice Notley and Nick Sturm are going to be talking about the Ted Bergen prose book. So I've sent an email around about that, but do feel free to come along and listen to them chat about it as well. But other than that, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
you again soon.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank
you.
you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yasmin
Me
too.
too.
I will do, yeah.
Yeah.
I will do.
Thanks for
Thank
giving
you.
up your Friday night.
Oh,
Yeah.
my pleasure. My pleasure.
6 o'clock. What time is it?